The phone call came at 11:47 p.m. Not a request, not an invitation, a summons. Al Capone, the most feared man in America, wanted a meeting. Lucky Luciano's people passed the message the way you pass a live grenade. Carefully, quickly, with 2 fingers. Lucky heard it, nodded once, and said 4 words, "Tell him I'm available." Then he hung up the phone, looked out at the Manhattan skyline, and spent the next 3 days building the most dangerous trap any criminal in American history had ever walked into. Not a trap made of guns, not a trap made of violence, a trap made of silence, of stillness, of one single word. November 8th, 1930, New York City, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The most luxurious address in America, the last place on earth Al Capone expected to feel outnumbered. Before you understand what happened that night, you need to understand what Al Capone was in the autumn of 1930. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a myth wearing a suit. 41 years old, Chicago's undisputed king. An empire estimated at $100 million a year, bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, protection. 600 men under his command, judges who took his calls before they took the bench. Police captains who cleared the street when his motorcade passed. Politicians who smiled for photographs standing next to a man who'd had 33 people killed in a single year. He had a face every newspaper reader in America recognized. That scar on his left cheek. 3 inches of raised skin running from jaw to ear. A souvenir from a knife fight in Brooklyn before he ever became famous. In Italian, they called him Scarface. In Chicago, they just called him the boss. In November 1930, Capone was at the summit of everything he'd ever wanted. And that was exactly why he was scared. Because the federal government had found the one weapon that didn't care how many cops you owned, how many judges you paid, how many bodies you could put into the ground. Tax evasion. They weren't coming for his violence. They were coming for his money. And Capone knew, in the way that intelligent, dangerous men always know when the ground is shifting beneath their feet, that Chicago might not be enough to save him. He needed new territory. He needed New York. And New York increasingly meant one man, Lucky Luciano. Charles Lucky Luciano was 33 years old in November 1930. He didn't look like what he was. That was the point. Medium height, lean, well-dressed in the way that said money without screaming it, dark eyes with a slight droop on the right side. The permanent reminder of a night in 1929 when rival gangsters took him for a ride on Staten Island and left him for dead on the roadside with his throat slashed and his left eye damaged. He'd survived. He'd walked back. He'd never spoken a word about who did it. The newspapers called him Lucky. He called himself Charlie. What Capone called him, privately, was the future, and futures made dangerous men nervous. Because Lucky wasn't building power through brutality, through fear, through the personal terror that Capone weaponized so effectively. Lucky was building something nobody in the American underworld had ever built before. A system, a commission, representatives from every major crime family in New York, sitting at the same table, resolving disputes, dividing territory, making collective decisions, not one king. A council, not personal power, institutional power. The kind of power that didn't disappear when one man went to prison. The kind of power that didn't need Al Capone's permission to function. That was the problem. That was the reason Capone had picked up the phone. Suite 2401, Waldorf, Astoria, 9003 p.m. Lucky Luciano sat in a chair by the window, legs crossed, hands loose in his lap. Glass of water on the table beside him. Not alcohol, water. He didn't drink before meetings that mattered. To his left, Meyer Lansky. Small, quiet, with eyes like a chess grandmaster, already 6 moves ahead, already calculating every outcome of every possible scenario. To his right, Albert Anastasia, not calculating anything, just present, a man who didn't plan violence so much as embody it, and who sat beside Lucky the way a loaded weapon sits beside a careful hand. 2 more men stood near the interior door, the one that connected to the adjoining suite, where 6 more were waiting. Armed, ready, patient, 12 men total in the building, not counting the lobby, not counting the street, not counting the 3 cars positioned at every exit of the Waldorf. Lucky had spent 3 days not building a trap for Al Capone. He'd built a city inside a city. and at 9,004 p.m., the most dangerous man in America walked into it. Capone came through the door the way dangerous men always enter rooms, like he owned them. 4 men behind him. Chicago muscle. The kind of men who'd been in situations where the only way home was through. 6 feet minimum, all of them. Shoulders that blocked doorways. Hands they kept loose and open, close to the weapons under their jackets. Eyes that went immediately to every person in the room, counting, sizing, filing. They were good. Lucky had better. And Capone, to his credit, understood that within about 4 seconds of stepping through the door, you could see it. The slight pause, the eyes doing one more pass around the room, the mental arithmetic of 5 against 5 resolving into 5 against 12 plus everything outside. The moment a predator walks into another predator's territory and recognizes, on an instinctual level, that the geometry has changed. Capone walked to the chair across from Lucky and sat down. He didn't show what he'd just calculated. Lucky would have respected him less if he had. "Charlie," Capone said. "Al," Lucky replied. "The room temperature dropped 10 degrees. What happened next? Most people get wrong. They imagine it as a confrontation between equals. 2 kings, eye to eye, neither willing to yield. That's not what it was. It was a lesson. 1 man teaching, 1 man learning, neither one saying those words out loud. Capone started the way powerful men always start. Obliquely, circling, warming up the conversation before he revealed what he'd actually come for. He talked about Chicago, the federal pressure, the newspapers, the way things were changing. Lucky listened, said very little, nodded occasionally. He let Capone feel like he was controlling the room. Then Capone said what he'd come to say. "I want direct operations in New York." His voice was even, deliberate, the voice of a man who'd made demands in rooms exactly like this one all his life and always gotten what he asked for. Numbers. Bootlegging, protection, 20% of Brooklyn, 10% of Manhattan, written and formalized. The silence that followed was the most expensive silence in American criminal history. Meyer Lansky didn't move. Albert and Anastasia didn't move. Lucky's 2 men by the door didn't move. Capone's 4 men along the wall didn't move. Everyone in that room understood that what happened in the next 30 seconds would determine whether they all went home tonight or whether this hotel suite became a slaughterhouse. Lucky looked at Capone for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. And then he said one word. "No. No. Not no but. Not no. Let's discuss alternatives. Not. No. Here's what I can offer instead. Just no. 2 letters. 1 breath. The most dangerous syllable Lucky Luciano ever spoke. Capone's men shifted. Hands moved half an inch closer to weapons. Meyer's right hand dropped below the table line. Albert went completely still in the specific way that Albert and Anastasia went still when violence was 3 seconds away. Capone's face didn't change. That was the tell. When men who are used to getting what they want receive a refusal, they react. They flush. They tighten around the eyes. They show, for just a moment, the anger underneath the composure. Capone showed nothing, which meant he was working very hard to show nothing. "You're telling me no," Capone said. His voice had gone quiet. Flat, Chicago flat, the vowels of a man who'd grown up poor and gotten rich and still carried both things in his mouth. New York isn't open to expansion. Your commission, your system, it doesn't include me. Your commission, Lucky said, and his voice was completely unnervingly level, includes Chicago representation at the table. You'll have a voice in decisions. What you won't have is 20% of Brooklyn, because 20% of Brooklyn isn't mine to give. That territory belongs to men who've held it with blood for 15 years. You want it, you take it from them. And then you have a war. And then nobody makes money. And then the feds have 6 easy convictions instead of 1. Capone leaned forward slightly. "You're not afraid of me, Charlie?" Lucky looked at him for a long, measured moment. "I'm afraid of wasted time," he said, "and this conversation is getting close." Capone stood up, not fast, not angry, deliberately, the way a king stands when he's decided how a meeting ends. He walked to the window, looked out at Manhattan 24 stories below. The city spread out like a circuit board running on light, all of it humming and alive and operating on rules that Capone had never written and was only beginning to understand. When he spoke, his voice was different. The performance was gone. What replaced it was something quietly, terrifyingly real. "You know what you're building," Capone said. It wasn't a question. "This commission, these rules, this system, you know what it actually is?" Lucky waited. "It's the thing that makes you unnecessary." Capone turned around. His eyes were completely clear. The mind behind them was working on something, arriving at something, and what his face showed was less anger than a particular kind of understanding. You build a machine that runs without you. Sooner or later, the machine decides it doesn't need you. You thought about that? Lucky looked at him. "I think about it every day," Lucky said. "That's how I know it works." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence. The first silence had been about violence, the possibility of it, the proximity of it, the decision happening in real time about whether blood would be spilled on the carpet of Suite 2401. This silence was about something else. It was the silence of a man looking across a room and seeing the future he'd been fighting against and understanding for the first time in his chest rather than just his mind, that it was going to arrive whether he fought it or not. Capone was the past. He knew it. Lucky could see the knowledge in his eyes, not defeat. Capone was too formidable for defeat, but recognition. The moment when a brilliant, violent, genuinely extraordinary man understands that the conditions that created him are changing, and that what made him the most powerful figure in American crime will not, cannot, survive the transition. Violence, and terror, and personal dominance. Those were Capone's tools. They worked. They'd worked for 20 years. They'd built an empire that made him famous across the world. And they were becoming obsolete, slowly, the way that everything powerful becomes obsolete, not with a crash, but with a drift, a gradual shift in what the world requires of the men who want to run it. Lucky had seen it before Capone. That was the difference between them. That was why Lucky was sitting in a chair, relaxed, water glass beside him, and Capone was standing at a window, looking at a city he would never own. "One more thing," Capone said. He was walking toward the door. His men moved with him, flanking the choreography of protection that Capone's people had perfected through years of exactly this. Exits from rooms where the conversation hadn't gone the way they'd hoped. Lucky waited. "This commission," Capone paused at the threshold, turned back one final time. The room held its breath. "It works until it doesn't, and when it doesn't. When somebody decides the rules don't apply to them, when somebody gets greedy, when somebody decides strength matters more than your system, it falls apart in a night, and you'll spend that night wishing you had what I have." "What's that?" Lucky asked. "Men who are afraid of me." Lucky was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Al," he said, "afraid men follow you until you're gone. Then they celebrate." Something passed across Capone's face. Not anger, not contempt. It was almost regret. "Good luck, Charlie," Capone said. And he meant it. You could hear it. The acknowledgement that passes between men who genuinely understand each other, who would have admired each other under different circumstances in a different world. Then he walked out. The door closed, and Lucky Luciano sat absolutely still for 15 seconds, listening to the sound of 4 men moving down the hallway, the elevator arriving, the doors closing, the cable pulling the car down 24 floors toward the lobby. Then he exhaled. Meyer spoke first. "He's going to prison," Meyer said. "Not a prediction. A statement. The calm assessment of a man whose mind ran on probability." "He knows it," Lucky said. "Was he testing you? Seeing if you deal from fear?" Lucky stood up and walked to the window. The same window where Capone had stood minutes ago, looking at the same city, the same lights, the same cold November sky over Manhattan. He was doing what powerful men do when they feel the ground moving, Lucky said. He was grabbing, looking for something solid. He was quiet for a moment. "I almost felt sorry for him." "Almost," Albert said from his chair. "Almost," Lucky agreed. Below, 24 stories down, a car pulled away from the hotel. Lucky watched it until it disappeared into traffic, just another car in a city full of them, carrying the most famous gangster in the world back toward an airport, back toward Chicago, back toward a federal indictment that would end everything he'd spent his life building. The last time anyone would see Al Capone as a free man with power, Capone left the Waldorf Astoria with exactly what he'd brought. Nothing from Lucky Luciano. Not a single % of anything. just the understanding, clear and cold and permanent, that the world he'd conquered was already becoming history. Half Capone was arrested in 1931, convicted of tax evasion, sentenced to 11 years, went to Alcatraz, came out broken by neurosyphilis, his mind already retreating from the present. Died on January 25, 1947 at his Palm Island estate. He was 48 years old. His empire had outlasted him by exactly 0 days. When Capone went to prison, the empire went with him because he had built it around himself instead of beneath himself. Lucky Luciano's commission outlasted Lucky by decades. When the feds finally got Lucky, not on tax evasion, on compulsory prostitution charges, a case he always said was fabricated, he didn't disappear. He was deported to Italy in 1946. From Italy, he still ran operations. He still mattered. He still picked up the phone and was taken seriously because the system he built didn't need him in the room to function. That was the whole point. That was what he'd tried to explain to Capone in that hotel suite on a cold November night, and what Capone had understood by the time he was sitting in a prison cell watching a city run fine without him. The most dangerous man isn't the one everyone fears. The most dangerous man is the one who builds something that doesn't need him to survive. Years later, in Palermo, a journalist found Lucky in a cafe. He was in his 60s, still sharp, still careful with words, still the man who'd looked at Al Capone across a hotel suite and said no without blinking. "Do you regret it?" the journalist asked. The meeting with Capone. Turning him away, Lucky looked at the journalist for a long moment. "What is there to regret?" he said. "He asked for something that wasn't mine to give. I told him so." A pause. "That's not a decision. That's just arithmetic. And if he'd pushed, if it had turned violent?" Lucky smiled. Just slightly. The smile of a man remembering the 50 men he'd had positioned throughout the Waldorf Astoria on the night of November 8, 1930. "It was never going to turn violent," he said. "How did you know?" "Because Al Capone was many things," Lucky said, and picked up his coffee. "But he was not stupid. He drank." The journalist wrote it all down, and across the Atlantic, in a country that had long forgotten him, the ghost of the empire that Al Capone had built was still gone, while the system that Lucky Luciano built with one word, a single no, in a 24th floor hotel suite, was still quietly running. Lucky Luciano, 1897-1962. The man who said no to the most dangerous man in America. The architect who outlasted the king. The one who understood that the future doesn't belong to men who take. It belongs to men who build. If this story gave you chills, subscribe. We find the moments history forgot to dramatize. The rooms nobody was supposed to survive. The conversations that changed everything. Turn on notifications. These stories drop every week. Drop a comment. Could Capone have walked out with more if he played it differently?